Plenty of talk among Canada's premiers and the Prime Minister this week in Saskatoon about so-called nation-building projects, including pipelines, of course. And as expected, interprovincial trade was another major topic. There are still roadblocks between the provinces, but today, the Nova Scotia government announced that it, along with 5 others, including PEI, have taken actions to remove some of the barriers and the red tape. Joining us tonight to talk about interprovincial trade, we're joined by Trevor Tombe, the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy. You're in town for a economic forum in Halifax. We want to thank you so much for coming in tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
First off, what is your reaction to the announcement we heard today from Nova Scotia and the other provinces?
So I'm very encouraged by the level of ambition that we're seeing, especially from Nova Scotia on internal trade. And we've been talking about it for years. You can see governments referring to internal trade challenges in the 80s and decades earlier, but It's now that we're seeing a lot of concrete action, really led by Nova Scotia earlier this year.
And why has it taken so long to get to this point, do you think?
Well, interprovincial trade costs are not tariffs like between countries. Right. They're really just about the rules and regulations and standards and certifications being different from one jurisdiction to another. And provinces are responsible for a great deal. And so easing these barriers are about cooperating across provinces, trying to harmonize some of the rules, or what we're seeing, like the announcement today from Nova Scotia, kind of mutually recognizing as valid the rules of another jurisdiction. Right. So provinces are ceding a little bit of independence and autonomy, if you will, but in the name of advancing productivity, economic growth, and improving Canada's economy.
One of the reasons we jumped all over ourselves to book you tonight when we found out you were in town is you've written a report on the economic impact of these barriers with a kind of a specific focus on Atlantic Canada. We're more affected than the others. Tell us about that.
That's right. Internal trade is a much more important part of the economy here in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick, and even larger part in Prince Edward Island. Total purchases from other provinces is roughly equivalent to about 1/3 of Nova Scotia's economy. You add in interprovincial exports to the equation, you get roughly half of economic activity. Internal trade, roughly speaking, about as important in terms of the total amounts as international trade.
Wow.
And that's much more than what you see in BC or Alberta, where it's about 1/5 of economic activity, or in Ontario, about 13%. So internal trade costs are much more impactful on productivity, growth, and economic activity here than many other provinces.
I feel like we should just take a quick step back and remind us why these barriers were put in place to begin with.
So they're not put in by governments to explicitly try and inhibit trade flows between provinces. It's not like tariffs between countries or what we're seeing south of the border, like deliberately protectionist policies. It's just that provinces will naturally adopt different rules at different times for different things, and that creates the friction for companies trying to buy and sell across provincial borders or operate across provincial borders, or people trying to move from one location to the next. Provinces just arrived at slightly different regulations because they had different people involved, regulations made at different points in time. So these differences, they're there just as kind of a consequence of our being a very decentralized federation.
And generally speaking, what impact do those those restrictions have?
It's really hard to overstate the gains of internal trade liberalization. So the paper that we're releasing tomorrow at the Public Policy Forum, takes a focus on Atlantic Canada and tries to think about what would mutual recognition deals even mean for these jurisdictions, even if just done within the region itself. We find that for Nova Scotia, you could have gains in terms of economic productivity of about 2.2%. Now that might sound small, but it's the equivalent of about $6,000 per Nova Scotia resident per year in additional economic activity. And the gains can be larger still when we're talking about mutual recognition with economies like Alberta, like we saw this morning, or Ontario or Quebec, much larger, closer economies.
And again, the number's higher here than they would be in some of those other provinces.
That's right, because internal trade is a much more important component of the overall economy here than in the larger provinces.
You're pleased with the announcement we heard from Nova Scotia today. Are you satisfied? Are you confident confident governments will follow through on all of these promises?
Well, what we have effective immediately, I understand, is the agreement with Alberta and Prince Edward Island coming into place today. And what that effectively does is allow goods and services that are compliant with regulations in Prince Edward Island or Alberta to be, now able to be sold in Nova Scotia, even if not technically compliant with local rules, and vice versa. So Nova Scotia businesses can sell elsewhere. There's a lot of other provinces, though, and a lot of other province pairs that will need to follow suit in order for the full gains to be realized.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are some provinces that are probably not kind of playing ball with all of this.
Well, we saw even last week, Quebec announced that they would be rolling out legislation that looks very much like what Nova Scotia passed earlier this year. And historically, Quebec has been the most, I don't want to say resistant, but the one least willing to move on internal trade costs. They have a lot of unique considerations in that province compared to others. So even Quebec has signaled that they're quite interested in really moving the needle on internal trade.
I only have about 10 seconds left. Will this be enough, do you think, to help offset some of the losses we're expecting given the U.S. trade situation?
The trouble is U.S. tariffs and trade uncertainty with the U.S. has a short-term and significant cost.
Right.
Internal trade liberalization has a much slower but longer-term gain.
Okay.
So the gains are large with internal trade liberalization, but if the U.S. adopts a 25% across-the-board tariff on things we sell, that's going to hurt this year. But long-term gains from internal trade, they're real.
Trevor, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Trevor Tombe is the Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the University of Calgary School of Public Policy. He is in Halifax participating in a forum at the Convention Centre, which is co-hosted by the Halifax Partnership, the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, and the Public Policy Forum. It all gets underway tomorrow morning. Stay with us. Be right back.